You are watching programming from the East-West Center in Washington, D.C.
Welcome. My name is Satu Lemay. I'm the Vice President of the East-West Center, and I also direct the East-West Center's Washington program. Welcome to this meeting on assessing US-ASEAN relations, the 2022 Special Summit and beyond. As you all know and are joining us to learn more about the Special Summit held in Washington, D.C. between President Biden and 8 of the 10 leaders of the ASEAN member countries this past week. And we are delighted to have an all-star cast of experts and government officials to brief us on the events and what we should look forward to. We're delighted to cooperate with American University's ASEAN Studies Initiative on this program. And we've had a long-running collaboration and cooperation, and we welcome them today. Before turning to our keynote speaker, let me invite the chair of the ASEAN Studies Initiative and professor at American University, Dr. Amitav Acharya, to make some brief remarks. Thank you, Amitav.
Thank you, Satu. I also want to extend my welcome to all of you who are here, but especially to those of you who have joined us from Southeast Asia, and really very nice of you to join us, even if it's late in the evening in the region. I just wanted to make one important at the beginning, and that is a transition at the ASEAN Studies Initiative. After 12 years of being the director of the ASEAN Studies Initiative, Dr. Heng Pek Kun has stepped down, and she'll still be with us as an advisor. But I just want to pay tribute to her because without her dedication, initiative, leadership, and organizational skills, I don't think the ASEAN Studies Initiative will be what it is today. So it is my sincere thanks and sense of gratitude to her, and hope to continue collaborating with her for the future. We are also very glad, very fortunate to welcome Ambassador Piper Campbell as our new head. She is at the moment the acting director, but I hope that won't be for too long. She will remain acting. So she has joined the American University faculty of our School of International Studies service as a senior professorial lecturer. So she has a long-term career with us in the faculty, and I hope she will lead the ASEAN Studies Initiative and take it to new heights. So thank you, Peck, and welcome, Piper. And I will now hand you back to Satu for sharing the keynote speech.
Thank you, Amitav. Congratulations to Ambassador Campbell. And of course, thank you, Dr. Pek Kun-heng, for so many years of your service on ASEAN studies and cooperation with the East-West Center. Now, this morning, it is my absolute pleasure and honor to welcome the United States Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia and the Pacific. He really does not need an introduction for those who are joining us today. He has had 30 plus years serving the United States diplomatic service. He's been most recently ambassador to Vietnam before taking his current role and a number of other assignments at the National Security Council as senior director and across the region. He brings an enormous amount of expertise and experience to his current position, and had a huge role in the recent US-ASEAN Summit. So we're delighted and honored to have with us Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia and Pacific, Daniel Kritenbrink. Daniel, thanks so much for joining.
Well, Satu, thank you so much for that kind introduction. Most importantly, thanks for inviting me and for doing this event. Really have been grateful to you, Satya, for your friendship and guidance and wise counsel over the years. And I know the East-West Center has played, such an important role in demonstrating why ASEAN matters for America, why America matters for ASEAN. And that could have been the theme, I think, of the US-ASEAN Special Summit last week. We thought the summit was incredibly successful, and that's what we were hoping to do, hoping to demonstrate very clearly to the American public and the American people why the ASEAN region is so vital to America's future security and prosperity. And conversely, we were trying to demonstrate again to our close partners in ASEAN why America matters for them. I'm really delighted to share some of the outcomes of last week's summit. and then talk a little bit about how it demonstrated the breadth and depth of our strategic partnership. We believe that the summit reflects the administration's commitment to our relationships in Southeast Asia and with ASEAN as an institution. We obviously have longstanding partnerships and treaty alliances with many friends across this vital region. And again, the summit underscored the importance of US-ASEAN cooperation to ensuring security and prosperity for our combined 1 billion people, as well as for the broader international community. So I viewed last week in many ways a celebration of the long history that we have together, the many things we've accomplished, and our bright future together. This was the first US-ASEAN summit held in Washington, D.C., and it was the largest in-person summit of the Biden-Harris administration. From my perspective, and I was honored to have a, what shall we say, a ringside seat for the entire two-day summit, we thought the event was a real home run. We commemorated the 45th anniversary of establishing the US-ASEAN Comprehensive Strategic Partnership, marked by expanded engagement on health, security, climate, transportation, and sustainable infrastructure, and women's empowerment, and more. Again, this is 45 years of relations with ASEAN. We were delighted in our outcomes document that we've announced that we are in fact going to upgrade our partnership to a comprehensive strategic partnership. We had high-level engagement. It started last Thursday with Speaker Nancy Pelosi's lunch with ASEAN leaders on Capitol Hill. It was followed by a fantastic business event hosted by the US-ASEAN Business Council and the US Chamber of Commerce. The president hosted the leaders at the White House for dinner on Thursday night. And then on Friday, we had a full day of dialogue at the State Department, hosted by the president, the vice president, and multiple cabinet secretaries, 6 total, I believe, cabinet secretaries. I thought that in the summit, the leaders had extraordinarily substantive and candid discussions, very productive exchanges on some of the most pressing issues that we all face today, including, of course, the crisis in Burma. You may have noted that we did reserve an empty chair for the Burmese delegate at the proceedings. And we thought that that empty chair represented not just the unfulfilled vision of the people of Burma for a democratic future, but also the regime's empty promises to the Burmese people. Our ASEAN colleagues agreed on the urgency of and the need to hold the regime fully accountable to the ASEAN 5-point consensus, including the cessation of violence and the pursuit of a peaceful resolution of the crisis. I think the leaders addressed a whole broad range of other issues, including the PRC's provocative actions in the South China Sea. They also discussed the DPRK's continued provocations, which are destabilizing not just in the Korean Peninsula, but threatens to destabilize the entire region. The leaders also talked very candidly about Russia's continued assault on Ukraine and the Ukrainian people, and on Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, and how that threatens the foundations of the international system. We're very proud of the joint vision statement that we negotiated with our friends in ASEAN. We thought it was quite powerful. It does lay out our vision for a freer, more prosperous, more interconnected, and more resilient Indo-Pacific region. Again, in it, I think you'll see very strong language on a host of issues from Burma to Russia, Ukraine, to maritime issues, to our cooperation on a range of transnational challenges, including climate change and combating the COVID-19 pandemic. We were also happy that when you look at that language and it talks about our cooperation, it also highlighted our close collaboration with other partnerships and groupings in the region, including the Quad, and our work together on the Quad vaccine initiative. In the joint statement, we also agreed to collaborate on sub-regional development, enhance our people-to-people ties, and many other issues. In addition, the United States released a fact sheet that outlined America's engagement and many of our new initiatives that we intend to launch vis-a-vis ASEAN. The fact sheet announced over $150 million in new initiatives, but I do want to underscore these were simply $150 million in new initiatives, and they build on the more than $12.1 billion US in development, economic, health, and security assistance that we have provided to Southeast Asia and our friends in ASEAN over the last 24 years. And that includes more than $1.4 billion in humanitarian assistance. So we expect all of these new initiatives will mobilize billions more in private financing that will further deepen US-ASEAN relations, strengthen ASEAN centrality, and expand our common capacity to achieve our shared objectives. I think one more important outcome from the summit that I do want to underscore this morning, Satu and friends, is that President Biden announced that senior NSC official Johannes Abraham will be his nominee to be the new US ambassador to ASEAN. For those of you who know Johannes, you know that he is a world-class person. He is a longtime and very close aide to the president, incredibly capable. He understands better than anyone the president's foreign policy approach, and if confirmed, I am very confident he will be an amazing ambassador, and he will ensure ever closer and better communications between the United States, the ASEAN Secretariat, and ASEAN member states. Satu, I just want to underscore, maybe more than anything, I think the US-ASEAN Special Summit last week demonstrated America's commitment to ASEAN and to Southeast Asia. And that commitment extends beyond just leader-level engagements. But we did attempt last week to show tremendous respect to the 9 leaders from Southeast Asia who were present. We really tried to roll out the red carpet and show just how much we respect them and their countries and ASEAN as an institution. But of course, our engagement with Southeast Asia extends well beyond just leaders. And we tried to demonstrate that last week as well. Last week, we hosted a number of civil society roundtables with activists from the region, as well as an event with the region's diaspora community in the United States, which really, I think, underscores, again, our deep ties to the region. Our future as a nation, our economic, military, and diplomatic power depend on our Indo-Pacific diplomacy, and our engagement with ASEAN also depends on our positive, affirmative, and proactive approach that we've laid out in our Indo-Pacific strategy. And again, that envisions a region that is ever more open and free, connected, prosperous, secure, and resilient. ASEAN is central to that. We strongly support ASEAN centrality. We strongly back the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific. As President Biden said at last week's summit, the ASEAN-US partnership is critical to meeting the moment we find ourselves in history right now. The President went on to promise that we'll continue to elevate this partnership and strengthen our cooperation to make a better, safer, and more prosperous world for all of our children. So Satu, let me stop there. Obviously, we thought the summit was a great success. Grateful to you for all of your support for hosting today's event. Look forward to learning from all of you. Thank you, my friend.
Thank you so much, Assistant Secretary Dan. Thanks. That's really terrific. And I want to congratulate you and the administration for the persistence of scheduling and getting the leaders here amidst, a few things going on in the world. So really, congratulations for making it happen. I think that was an important marker. I understand you are willing to take a couple of questions.
Absolutely.
And let me start off with also congratulating the administration for naming a nominee for the ambassador to ASEAN. I think that's terrific news. I heartily wish for a speedy confirmation, and we can move on from there with our engagement. Now, one thing that was not mentioned specifically in the vision statement that was issued by the parties in the summit, but will come up even more, I understand, from press reports and Secretary of Commerce's comments as the president gets ready to go to Korea and Japan, is the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. And I'd like your thoughts on kind of what you took away from the summit about the state of play from the Southeast Asian perspective. And from our perspective meaning the US perspective, the Indo-Pacific strategy has a wonderful line about the importance of Indo-Pacific prosperity for America and for everyday Americans is the precise quote. And I wondered if you could say how you envision the IPEF playing that role to continue the robust trade and investment relationship between the US and the region.
Satu, thank you, and thank you for your comments as well. Look, we were delighted with the summit. Obviously, getting 10 world leaders together in the middle of the current crisis, including the crisis over Russia's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine, is quite challenging. But I think it shows a couple of things. It shows our commitment to ASEAN, that even amidst everything else going on, we really wanted to demonstrate how vital ASEAN is to American interests in our security and prosperity. And I think the same could be said for our ASEAN leaders who are willing to travel all the way here. Look, I think a couple of comments on IPEF. First of all, very strong demand signals from our friends in ASEAN for continued, sustained, and increased American engagement with the region, including in terms of economics and trade. So we've heard that signal loud and clear. IPEF is part of our response to that, and I would say, even though that our discussions on the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework were not a formal part of the ASEAN agenda, I think, as you're aware, we are consulting closely with many partners in ASEAN on IPEF. So there were many conversations on the margins about IPEF, and I think we'll have more to say on that in the very near future. But of course, we should go back to last October when the president first announced IPEF. It was at the US-ASEAN Summit last fall and the East Asia Summit. So I think we're trying to demonstrate that friends across the region, including ASEAN, are important to America's economic future. Secondly, and again, we've said a bit about this publicly, you'll see more, I think, in the coming days, but we believe that IPEF is really an important framework for allowing us to work together with our closest partners on the key sectors of the 21st century economy. And we think it's an important, dynamic, and significant agreement. We are consulting very closely with partners across the region. And again, I would say stand by for more in coming days. Maybe if I could add just another point or two. You mentioned that we've spoken about why ASEAN is so important to the United States economically, why it justifies launching something like IPEF. I asked my team to put together a few stats. In 2021, the United States had more than $430 billion in two-way trade with ASEAN economies, which I think is extraordinary. U.S. foreign direct investment in ASEAN countries totaled $328.5 billion in 2020, making the U.S. ASEAN's largest source of investment. U.S. exports from almost 42,000 companies across 50 states to ASEAN support more than 625,000 U.S. jobs. We could go on and on. I can give you many more stats, but I think that demonstrates, obviously IPEF is an important agreement, but let's not lose sight of the fact that our economic ties and trade links with ASEAN are already quite robust and significant.
Well, thank you so much for that. We have one question from Dr. Amitav Acharya, and then I'll maybe take, if there's time, one more question, but Amitav?
Yes, so the question to Assistant Secretary is about the empty chair. So the empty chair, of course, is Burma, Myanmar, and I looked at the joint statement, and I really didn't get anything that's really new about the approach to Burma, Myanmar, except reaffirming the 5-point consensus reached last April. But as we know, the consensus is not going anywhere. It hasn't really produced any change. In fact, things have become much worse. So a lot of the NGOs and observers are actually now asking that the US and the ASEAN countries should do something more, something more intrusive. So what's your thought on that? And how did you approach the issue of Burma, Myanmar at the summit?
Well, Dr. Amitav, thank you very much for your question and your comments. Look, the situation in Burma or Myanmar remains tragic. If I can say that, this truly is a tragedy that the junta has imposed on the people of Burma. And we continue to see the junta's brutality on display every day. We spent a considerable amount of time in the plenary sessions themselves discussing the situation in Myanmar, and having had the pleasure of spending 7.5 hours with our ASEAN SOMs in the closing negotiating session on the joint vision statement. We did spend a lot of time discussing the situation in Myanmar. I think if you look at the joint vision statement language, which you have, you can see we've expressed our deep concern over the ongoing crisis. We continue to state that the ASEAN 5-point consensus will remain the focus of our approach. And we also tried to demonstrate through the empty chair that we are going to remain firm, both the United States and our friends in ASEAN, in not relenting on our support of the 5-point consensus and our intent to hold the regime in Burma accountable. And obviously it was ASEAN that first established this precedent of not inviting Myanmar at a political level to ASEAN summits until there is progress. Obviously, we're going to need to do a lot more than simply have an empty chair and negotiate strong joint vision statements. But I think you can see the outlines of what our approach is in the joint vision statement. It's continuing to take steps to place pressure on the regime to change course. And it's continuing to focus with our closest partners, especially in ASEAN, on humanitarian assistance. You'll also note that we express support for the ASEAN Special Envoy, our friend, Foreign Minister in Cambodia, but also for the work of the Special Envoy of the UN Secretary General on Myanmar. So look, I would just say, Doctor, with respect, we didn't expect the US-ASEAN Summit to solve the crisis in Myanmar, but we did want to demonstrate our shared resolve and demonstrate clearly, including to Naypyidaw, that we are united on this issue, and we're going to continue to take a very firm stance. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you so much, Assistant Secretary Kritenbrink. I know your schedule is always so full, so we're deeply grateful for you taking the time, energy, and effort to join us this morning and to give us those very useful remarks to set the stage for the fireside chats that follow. And we wish you continued success. I'm sure you're getting busy for the upcoming presidential visit to the region. And
I am, as a matter of fact. We depart tomorrow, I believe. So we're excited about that as well. Maybe we can talk about that as well. We're very excited about that too. And Satu, just want to say how grateful I am to you and the East-West Center for doing this, for inviting me. Great to see my good friend, Ambassador Piper Campbell, as well. Congratulations to her. Look forward to learning your conclusions from this event, and then maybe we can talk about the president's visit to Northeast Asia at a future date as well.
We absolutely welcome it. It's a standing offer for you to have an East-West Center platform. And may I invite you, if you get a little rest from your duties, we'll invite you to come out to Hawaii as well and give a talk. So perhaps on your way back. You can't wait. Okay.
You know, we're very interested in the Pacific Islands as well. Maybe we can think about doing something together in Hawaii on that. Thank you, my friend, and thanks to everyone.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it.
Be well, Assistant Secretary.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Terrific, everyone. We're so grateful to have the Assistant Secretary, but now we turn to our wonderful experts as well. And I turn it over to Ambassador Piper Campbell, a good colleague and friend, and thank you for your cooperation in your new role, Piper. We're looking very much forward to working with you and your colleagues at American University.
Thank you, Satu. Thank you so much, Assistant Secretary Kritenbrink, for joining us and for those remarks. And thank you, Amitav, as well, for your kind remarks at the top. I'm very much looking forward to leading the ASEAN Center Initiative, ASEAN Studies Initiative at American University starting this summer. It's my pleasure to kick off our first panel with Marc Mealy and Mr. Ed Sim. And we decided that we would start with the economic pillar for this discussion, because as I think the comments so far have actually highlighted nicely, there is a strong demand signal from the region. And not only from the region, but also from US business organizations like the US-ASEAN Business Council and the US Chamber. So we're going to give both Marc and Ed a few minutes to sort of frame this discussion. And then we're going to really get into a nice a dialogue and have a real chat to try to explore what the summit actually delivered in the economic space and where people might feel that there's going to be more work needed in implementation and moving forward. So I am so pleased to be joined by Mr. Marc Mealy, the Senior Vice President Policy at the US-ASEAN Business Council, an organization with which I had the pleasure of working very closely when I served as the head of the US mission to ASEAN. Marc is an international economist by training and has over 20 years of experience in international trade. And he has an interesting background in that he's worked in both the executive and legislative branches and for an international NGO. The US-ASEAN Business Council, as well as the US Chamber, co-hosted an event with the private sector during last week's special summit, bringing together US-ASEAN businesses, ASEAN officials, as well as key stakeholders from the US government. I understand Secretary of Commerce Raimondo, Trade Representative Catherine Tai, as well as Climate Envoy John Kerry were at that event, and we're curious to hear Marc's views on how that event went, and again, what the US-ASEAN Business Council might hope to see moving forward. We also are joined from Medan, I would note, by Mr. Edmund Sim, who is an international lawyer, a partner with Appleton Luff, who resides and works in both Washington and Singapore, and so perfectly kind of encapsulates what we're trying to do with this session by bringing voices both from the region and from Washington. And Ed has represented companies and governments in a wide range of international trade disputes. And so I think his perspective on what governments from the region might have hoped and might continue to hope they'll see coming out of IPEF and coming out of other conversations that occurred in the margins of the US-ASEAN Summit, that will be a very important perspective. Marc, I'm going to ask you to go first, giving us some framing remarks, and then we will turn to Edmund.
Great, thank you so much, Ambassador. And let me again acknowledge and thank also our friends at the East-West Center, and of course the American University's ASEAN Studies Center for organizing this program and for inviting me to participate. As has already been noted, we've heard from the Assistant Secretary, there's been great demand from ASEAN leaders to really, for the United States government in particular, to sort of step up its game and when it comes to sort of economic engagement with the region. I think the realities that we're facing today, which is while on one hand, there is a very robust US-ASEAN trade relationship, as the Assistant Secretary mentioned, over $400 billion in two-way trade in goods and services in 2021. And also the fact that in 2021, 6 of America's top 31 trade partners in the world are actually ASEAN member states, led by Vietnam, which is now in 2021 has moved up to become America's 10th largest trading partner in the world. At the same time, though, here in 2022, the competitive landscape in the Indo-Pacific region in terms of trade and investment relations is becoming increasingly complex and increasingly competitive. And for example, if this summit had taken place in, let's say, 2016 or 2017, we'd be having a very different discussion about what would come next. But the fact that the summit is taking place here today, or 2022, the fact that the IPEF is going to be launched when the president goes out to the region, has to be seen in the context of the United States government really has not been very deeply engaged for a number of years. And in the course of that period of time, many other competitors have been very actively engaged. New preferential, regional preferential trade agreements have been going online. For example, the RCEP agreement is now the world's largest FTA. There are also current negotiations with major trading partners like Canada, that's right now in the midst of an FTA, comprehensive FTA talks with Southeast Asia. And there's also the emergence of next generation digital economic and trade agreements like the DEAs that Singapore is leading. So it's in this context that when the summit is happening, that when the IPEF is going to be proposed or formally launched, it's in a context of a much more globally competitive and regional environment that the United States government now has to sort of re-engage, or as I think the term is said, getting sort of a seat back at the table in terms of these types of initiatives. But understanding though that one, the table has changed. There are also new leaders at the table. And there's also a wider variety of options that are on the table for states in the region to engage. So I think in that context, we are really, I guess, at the start of perhaps a period of renewed engagement by the administration, certainly supported by members of the U.S. business community. And certainly we can share more about the event that the business community created that was a formal part of the summit to sort of bring in those dimensions of private sector perspectives on trade and investment with a real focus on three areas. One, the questions around energy transitions and climate and sustainability. Two, supporting economic recovery in the region in relation to sort of the travel and tourism industries. Obviously, again, the beginning of sort of people being able to move across borders sort of in this post-COVID environment. And also three, the growing importance of ASEAN's digital economy, which really is one of the fastest growing digital economies in the world, and sort of the dynamics and relationships between US companies, US private sector players in that context of how to be able to plug in to this rapidly growing digital economy in the region. So that might be a good place to start. And certainly when we get into the Q&A and discussion, we can dive more deeply into some of the particular takeaways and really potentially some of the next steps that have to follow.
You know, I was talking with an ASEAN ambassador in advance of the summit, and I asked him what ASEAN countries hope for. And one of the prime things he mentioned was actually the opportunities to engage with the US private sector. Mm-hmm. And I think that it's interesting to note how much ASEAN leadership understands the role and the importance of the US private sector. Ed, thank you so much for joining us. And I'm interested, as you think about the summit and as we look at the situation, what are your opening thoughts as we think about what was achieved and what perhaps was left on the table?
Yeah, thanks for the introduction, Piper, and always great to hear from Marc and some of the other folks who are on this great program. And thank you to American University and the East-West Center. I think from the private sector and from clients like my client, where I'm here in Medan, I'm actually involved in representing a Indonesian palm oil producer, which is in a trade dispute with the European Union. So that goes to what Marc was saying about other regions engaging with ASEAN. As we think about what my own clients and what my own experience has been with the FTA and the regional economic integration efforts, I think the question of the economic pillar, because this presentation is built among the three pillars of ASEAN. The question is, what really is IPEF, and what are we going to see from the economic portion of our engagement? Mm-hmm. So I'm not going to be as negative. There's some people who have said that basically there were two empty chairs at the ASEAN summit. One was for Myanmar and one is for economics. I think that's very unfair, but I can see where that point of view has come across. I would liken it more to, the real question I would liken more to with economics is, what was presented at the summit and what are we going to do? Is this going to be just the first course of a multi-course meal, or is this all we're going to get? Because if this is all we're going to get, then essentially what the United States has presented to the ASEAN partners is something like a meat substitute, like what you wanted a hamburger, and instead you're presented with a Beyond Burger, or a Beyond Burger that doesn't even look like a burger. And you can say that, yes, it's good for you. A lot of the initiatives for digital and supply chain, they're good for you. You should do this. In fact, this is something you should have done already. And I think that if you go with that approach, you're overlooking the fact that, yes, we do have in the United States domestic concerns where it prevent us from offering the full, Big Mac or Whopper to the other side. But you have to understand from the ASEAN point of view, both from the governments and from businesses, they also have their own constituents. So if you're trying to say that, oh, you should do this for your own good, and you would do it anyway, then their point is, yeah, that doesn't satisfy their constituents. So the real question is this the first course, or is this the many meals, or is this all you're going to get? Because if this is all we're going to be able to offer ASEAN, I think we're going to have some takers who are willing to swallow, this offering on economic policy, but the general take up would not be as great as we anticipate. And I think we will be sorely, we will be missing an opportunity to expand and continue to grow our relationship with the region. So that's my initial thoughts on what came out of the summit last week.
So I, for one, am a fan of Beyond Burgers, but I'd like to be optimistic, and I'll pick up on your optimism, Ed, and say, hopefully this is the first course. Hopefully we're going to go beyond where we are right now. And I'd love Marc's thoughts on some of the things coming out of the session that you hosted, some of the areas where we might be able to go beyond where we are right now.
Sure. So at the part of the summit that we thought really added value to the overall, G2G engagement, because we all know relationships matter, and certainly the summit did provide a great opportunity for a lot of relationship building amongst a broad range of, U.S. cabinet secretaries and ASEAN officials. We haven't even touched on the fact that, as you can imagine, anytime you have a summit like this, you have a wide range of bilateral engagements. And so there were tons, again, of G2G bilateral conversations, which again are important. But as we all know, ASEAN values both the bilateral engagements for individual ASEAN member states, but also for major partners to engage ASEAN as ASEAN. And I think, again, obviously the summit did try to check that box. So in terms of the program with the private sector, we did have a 2-hour dialogue that involved a number of American corporate CEOs, the ASEAN leaders, as well as 2 cabinet secretaries, Ambassador Tai and Secretary Raimondo, as well as Special Envoy John Kerry. As I indicated, the conversation really kind of focused on, again, 3 topics. Again, energy transition and climate, economic recovery vis-a-vis the travel and tourism industries, as well as the digital economy kinds of issues and questions. I think from the US private sector, the primary focus was on highlighting both opportunities, whereas energy companies want to maybe begin to invest more in renewables or cleaner energy infrastructure in Southeast Asia, what that really requires in terms of financing, what it requires in terms of rules and policies and regulations to sort of make those longer term investment. Industry people highlighted that some of the initiatives that my organization and other organizations are doing already in terms of trying to, again, help the travel and tourism space recover. So for example, we've actually been operating what we call travel and tourism roadshows in various countries in Southeast Asia, where industry and government have kind of come together and said, we know there's a public health reality that we have to deal with. At the same time, we want to encourage, obviously, the return of livelihoods, so to speak. And how can we do those things safely? And the industry has been able to put on the table where we think standardizing certain types of rules, best practices in the tourism industry and for travel, there's ways of beginning to move that industry forward. And I think in terms of digital development, again, with ASEAN growing so rapidly in this space, a number of sort of our digital tech companies, whether they be in finance or whether they be in tech purely, are continuing to raise, again, opportunities for sure, but also to highlight that we do remain challenges from a sort of a policy and regulatory level. As we all know, every country is sort of on their own national digital journeys and coming at obviously at different levels of development. And so as governments, whether they be regulators who are trying to figure out, a good privacy law or how to approach cybersecurity, how to find that good balance that allows for certain public policy objectives in terms of digital economy development to be worked on, but at the same time done in ways that encourage, again, innovation, encourages investment. And here we're talking about things like, how can we make sure data can move securely and safely and freely across borders? So these were some of the types of sort of US business concerns and, again, and opportunities. that were put on the table with the leaders. It gave the leaders an opportunity to respond, and certain government leaders chose to respond again on energy transition, where they're seeing the needs, whether it be in terms of new technology access, whether it be in terms of human resource development, and obviously in terms of the digital space. Again, there's lots of questions about how to sort of build that institutional and regulatory capacity in order to really understand how fast technology is changing. The kinds of challenges that we know our own government and our own society is wrestling with. ASEAN leaders highlighted some of those concerns as well. But nonetheless, I think it was a great opportunity as part of the summit to kind of at least put into the formal program some discussion at a high level about economics and about trade. And as the Assistant Secretary mentioned, IPEF was not a particular topic of discussion because, as we all know, IPEF is not purely a sort of an ASEAN-focused initiative. Nonetheless, I think it was very clear. We got two clear signals, I think, from the ASEAN member states on IPEF when it goes forward. Number one, there should be a way for IPEF to be perceived as an inclusive regional economic initiative. And I think from the ASEAN perspective, a number of leaders highlighted that they would like to see an IPEF that at least is open to the participation of all, well, perhaps not Myanmar, but all ASEAN member states that would be interested in sort of joining that particular framework. I think that was a very important message that the ASEAN member states articulated. And then we'll have to see with the launching of the IPEF next week and subsequent activity in that space, how well the US government is able to respond to that message.
Yeah, and I actually had a question on that, and I see Satu has his hand up, and I know we only have a few more minutes for this session, but I wonder, and Ed, I wonder if you have any thoughts on this particular question. It's somewhat awkward that not all the ASEAN members may qualify for or be interested in the conditions likely to come up in the IPEF. And what does that do to ASEAN solidarity?
Well, I think, although ASEAN solidarity and centrality is at the core of the region's economic policy and international relations, there is also something, built into ASEAN called ASEAN minus X, and that is the real understanding that not all members are ready to go forward with some of the more advanced disciplines that would be engaged in IPEF. And in fact, going back to my earlier analogy about whether this is the first course or whether this is the only course. And I think, we've had these discussions about linking the newer disciplines, the newer economic issues to traditional market access, okay? And that, of course, that package of the new and the old was, of course, the TPP, now called the CPTPP. And from the ASEAN point of view, this CPTPP is meant to be the current iteration has a seat at the table reserved for the United States should we wish to come back. And how we got this TPP and CPTPP was exactly through ASEAN minus X. Not all the ASEAN countries are members of CPTPP, yet they were willing to engage with us at the time, and they're still willing to engage with us. So not having everyone at the table doesn't necessarily prevent the ASEAN members from going forward. The real question is, what are we offering to everyone so that the X in ASEAN minus X will eventually sign up? So if, in other words, if all we're offering is, it is not attractive, and we only get maybe 2 members of ASEAN showing up in the initial stage, if we don't provide something attractive for the Southeast Asian countries, then the remaining 7 or 8 may never show up, and then we're missing out both on an economic opportunity for the United States, but we're also missing out on a geopolitical opportunity for the United States in the region.
And just to chime in that quickly, I think Ed's point is so spot on, and that was why my initial point was there are so many other initiatives that are already in place.
Yeah.
and other initiatives that are being currently negotiated as we speak. So the menu, the competition is already there. And as Ed said, if certain countries feel like I already have 10 things on my menu, if IPEF doesn't offer sort of a net new opportunity, I'll probably just continue to work on the things that I'm already in, so to speak.
And you know, something I find fascinating is that a Gallup poll from March showed that Americans actually are becoming more positive about trade and about the opportunities from trade. And so I hope that perhaps the administration kind of catches up with that and becomes more open to broader and more ambitious trade objectives. Satu, I want to take your question.
Yeah, thank you, Piper. That's great. And Ed and Mark, as always, so engaging and brilliant insights. Couple of things to clarify. Mark, you said you had two key Southeast Asia ASEAN messages you took away. One was there should be a path in IPEF to be inclusive and open to all. I didn't catch the second one, so that's just a factual point. And I want to just push this, for the sake of this discussion a little bit on this issue of all ASEAN must join, and this competitive and complex environment. The table has changed, as Mark said. I think, Mark, you and I have discussed this over the years. Ed, you and I have been in many sessions discussed. Let me just throw an alternative, just a way of testing this proposition. Sure, the region is more complex and more competitive, but that very complexity and competition has the net impact of raising standards on just the key areas we want to raise standards on, particularly vis-a-vis private sector role that Mark described in the three areas, could in fact, not by government fiat or government policy or government negotiation, slowly lift up the standards as which private sectors from European Union, Japan, Canada, and others. So the net effect is where we want to go, even if the tool is not ours. So I want to push that a little bit and see, is that sufficient? And second, in this same spirit of kind of testing the propositions, why does everyone from ASEAN have to be in? Isn't that, I mean, we're talking about next generation standards in, look, there are many pillars of IPEF. I'm not sure what the final announcement will say, but we know that at least in three areas, clean energy, digital, and tourism and travel, less so, these are pretty high standard next generation areas. And not everyone is eligible either for CPTPP or for IPEF or for an FTA or particular agreements in TIFA. Why must we include, why is ASEAN the only region where we have to include everyone? If they all want to sign up to RCEP, God bless and go forward. If some of you want to dock on to CPTPP, wonderful, your domestic politics make that possible. Just laying that out there for your responses.
I think very quickly, number one, let me go to the second point. The second message that we got from the ASEAN folks, as part of one, we'd like the IPEF to be perceived as an inclusive regional framework. Because we all know all of the other major regional frameworks, whether they use the ASEAN minus X approach, whether it's RCEP, whether it's these other kinds of things, at least offer the pathway. And I think what we're probably really getting at here is, and we haven't mentioned it here, of course, is the perception that it's not a quote unquote anti-China initiative, because none of the other initiatives in the region that are truly regional are explicitly anti-China. As we know, China has now applied to join CPTPP.
Yep.
They've applied to join DIPA, so to speak. So those, I think that's the perception question that's there. I think you've hit the nail spot on the head in terms of there are a wide range of initiatives, both by governments as well as businesses, that are elevating standards, that are pushing the evolution of rules and regs, et cetera, et cetera. In a competitive environment, I think the question for, let's say, the US perspective or US business community is, in that competition, where there are other initiatives being led by other countries, both within the region, but potentially also influenced by other major partners, do the next generations of rules and regs get created without, quote unquote, the US government or US private sector input into the formulation of those future rules? For example, I think like in the digital space, and when I talk to people in the region, I'm hearing that the DEPA, the Digital Economic Partnership Agreement, is becoming a bit more popular amongst governments in Asia as a potential pathway that is perceived as inclusive, has maybe an ASEAN minus X dimension to it, maybe better fits to how individual governments are approaching sort of their national digital economic development journeys. Long story short, I'll go out on a limb. DEPA 10 years from now may be the basis for the digital version of RCEP one day, okay? Just as a source of influence of how things are evolving over time. America's not in DEPA. America's not in RCEP. So therefore, how does America get to participate in those processes? I will close with this. I think the administration recognizes sort of this competitive landscape. And I think the administration, when it tries to look at the individual modules, and we could talk about the trade module, which I think will be the most complex one because it tries to weave digital, environment, labor, and a bunch of other things. But I think it'll be clear that the administration should pull in perhaps examples of these other initiatives and try to make them part of the IPEF negotiation process. If they want to then bring in, I think, or make it perhaps politically more feasible for more other countries in the region to say, okay, we can participate in IPEF because you want to pull in, you know, the chapter on data privacy from the US-Japan bilateral agreement as the basis for how we would create a segment on privacy. So I think that would be a very smart and pragmatic reality check for the administration going forward.
Thank you. Yeah, and to quickly address the question of doing these things is good. So even if we're not really the instigator of that, that's true. Generally that's true. However, we again are missing out on the opportunity. Economics, cultural, security, they're all part of the same package that we need to offer to the region. The war in Ukraine shows that you cannot just rely purely on a security relationship. We are now, you know, in the midst of passing a massive aid bill to Ukraine, and that's economics. So we've got to be able to offer both. You have to, you know, it cannot just always be dependent solely on the security relationship. We've got to offer all three things. Or otherwise, we having an unbalanced approach to the region can have long-term repercussions and has had long-term repercussions to our ability to operate in the policy space in Southeast Asia.
Well, Ed, I think you just laid the table very nicely for us to hand over to Satu and the next session, which is the political security pillar. Thank you, Ed. Thank you, Marc, so much for participating with me in this discussion.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Piper, Ed, and Marc. That was terrific. And now we turn to our discussion of politics and security elements of the summit and, of course, of the ASEAN project, that pillar of the ASEAN project. And we have three very distinguished folks with us. We have Mr. Murray Hiebert, needs no introduction, author of a recent book on China's relations with the region, amongst many others. He's at senior associate at CSIS, as you all know. Cheng Chui Krek, who's had an associate professor at the Center for Asian Studies at the National University of Malaysia. Cheng Chui, great to see you again as well. And we have from Thailand the long-serving expert and Bangkok Post journalist Kavi Chungkitavorn. So welcome to you all, and let's take it away. The full bios are in your program, and in order to give them maximum time, let's just move right to Murray and ask for some initial comments, and we'll go from there.
Great. Thanks, Satu and the East-West Center and Amitav and the American University ASEAN Studies Center for the kind invitation. But I'm going to just pick a few highlights to talk about from the political security side. I think the one thing I want to start by saying is it's been said by others, but it's a really great thing that after a 5-year hiatus, when ASEAN relations seemed somewhat adrift, that this summit finally happened. It's like, a pregnant woman finally being able to give birth to a baby. And that's sort of like how it seemed for the last bunch of months, over a year now under Biden. But like Ed Sim said in the previous panel, this is only the first course, and it's going to require 11 more courses in an elaborate Chinese dinner. And the other thing I'd like to say is that about a general comment is that ASEAN keeps saying the US is missing. And it's been saying this since the Vietnam War ended. But frankly, it's not always easy for the US to figure out what this diverse grouping actually wants in trying to find ways to cooperate on economic and security issues. And frankly, this group often is pretty weak and disparate. Right now, we're in a period of several very weak governments that have often been much stronger and played a more active role. So some of the ball has to be in ASEAN. It's not really fair to blame only the United States, although I know a lot of people in ASEAN like to do that. I'll begin with talking about a couple of the initiatives. One of the biggest ones, the biggest one in money terms, there were 150 million committed, as Assistant Secretary Kritenbrink mentioned. One of the biggest is the Maritime Initiative, which will support regional maritime capacity building for law enforcement, help countries deal with IUU fishing. It'll deploy a cutter to the region and provide various training platforms. And it'll be led by the Coast Guard. And I would guess, China was barely mentioned in the summit intentionally, I guess, by all sides. But this initiative, the Maritime Security Initiative, is probably one that gives China some of the most heartburn. I know it's already been said about Johannes Abraham being appointed ambassador. I think this is a fantastic idea. We have, it's obviously the seat's been empty since the end of the Obama administration, but with Johannes being the chief of staff in the National Security Council, very close to Biden, it's going to be possible for somebody to be pushing and shoving on ASEAN relations who has direct ties into the Oval Office. And I think that could potentially be quite significant. Then there are also a bunch of bilateral initiatives that I think are merit mentioning, because they do indicate a little bit of some of the stuff going on around the edges. But one of the relations that has been drifting for decades, hope I'm not exaggerating, certainly for a long time, is the US-Thai relations. And with the first inaugural integrated 2+2 meeting, this could go a long way in trying to start resetting drifting relations. I know a lot more has to be done. One meeting is like a canary in a coal mine. It doesn't really solve all the problems. Another one that some people have pointed out is really interesting is the semiconductor supply chain agreement with Malaysia. I know it's economics, we finished with that, but I want to just mention that this development was pretty, it was perceived with some anxiety by China as having much broader implications. And some in the state media in China has carried stories about this agreement being part of IPEF, and it's an effort by the US to pick off a few ASEANs for a US-led semiconductor alliance against China. Probably nobody in the US government or ASEAN thought about it in advance, but at least it created a little heartburn in Beijing. The other thing which really isn't quite part of the summit, but it happened during the summit, is that President Biden called President-elect Marcos to congratulate him and for his election. And I think this is going to probably help at least set a tone for better relations. Marcos has had tough relations over the years for obvious reasons. He inherited, is taking over from a regime, the Duterte regime that's had a lot of trouble with the US. Maybe this will give a bit of a start. It's clear Marcos is close to the Chinese, but maybe this gives a bit of a start to getting relations back on track. And then another thing that's probably peripheral also is that a Deputy Secretary of State, Wendy Sherman, met with Prak Sokhonn to talk about the Ream Naval Base, which I know it gives more heartburn in Washington than in ASEAN, but I thought it's a good thing to have mentioned. And about the Myanmar empty chair, in addition to US officials meeting with the NUG, the National Unity Government, some ASEANs also met. Malaysia is the only one that's admitted it so far publicly, but I understand from others that there were others that met as well. And I'll conclude with a few comments on the deferred decision to upgrade relations. I know Assistant Secretary Kritenbrink talked about this as already being a fait accompli, but the vision statement talked about delaying the move from a strategic partnership to a comprehensive partnership until November. And this is this comprehensive strategic relationship has already been done by ASEAN with Australia and China last year. This, just having talked about it, probably cleared the air for Biden to go in November. It cleared the political air, but there's another political storm on the horizon, and that is the US midterm elections that are happening around the time of the G20, APEC, and ASEAN meetings in Indonesia, Thailand, and Cambodia. And that probably means that Biden is not going to go. I would bet there. And this finally on that same point, it's interesting to note that the Prime Minister of Vietnam being viewed often as one of the closest US friends in the region, said publicly that Vietnam wasn't really ready to upgrade ties. And he also said that Vietnam, he said this at the ASEAN, he said it several times, but at the US ASEAN Business Council, US Chamber breakfast, he said with USTR Tai sitting there, that Vietnam was not yet ready to join the IPEF, that it really needed to see what is in this. And he suggested that maybe the USTR Tai might want to consider putting the US back into the CPTPP, which does suggest that even a country that's close to the US, like Vietnam, is under a lot of other pressure beyond its pressure from the United States. So with that, I'm going to stop, and I look forward to comments from my friends Cheng Chui and Kawi. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Murray. Let's then turn to Cheng Chui.
All right. Thanks very much, Satu, and also Amitav for including me in this panel, this webinar. It's great to see so many friends and also familiar faces, even though just virtually. So in the few minutes that I have, I'm going to make 3 points, and that are the 3 types of policy gaps in the US Southeast Asia perspective. And some of you might be wondering, why talk about policy gaps when the prevailing mood of the day is actually to highlight and to celebrate the accomplishments, the achievements of from the Special Summit. I can say that, of course, I'm following Satu's footsteps. In 2005, he has a famous article about minding the gaps. So what I'm doing is exactly what he was doing some 18 years back. But also as someone who studied IR in Washington, DC, one of the things that I learned during that period was, of course, I think identifying gaps, policy gaps, is a very painful but necessary and critical step in any important policy analysis. So I thought that in this case, US-Southeast Asia relationship, although we do want to highlight the achievement, it's important also to highlight what are the kind of gaps that we have seen before, during, and also after the summit. So there are 3. Number one, it's about imbalanced strategy. And number two is about uneven expectations. And number three, uncertain future. Let me be a little bit elaborative on the first and very, very brief on the second and also on the last. So first thing first, why we describe US policy in Southeast Asia as imbalanced strategy. And this is particularly about US Indo-Pacific strategy. It's being perceived as an imbalance in the sense that I think many of us in Southeast Asia in the region see that the US has been paying a lot of attention, greater attention on the military chessboard, on military, on defense, and also maritime issues, but relatively under-investing in the second chessboard, the non-military chessboard, especially on the economic engagement, infrastructure building, developmental aspect, so on and so forth. And don't get me wrong, I'm not suggesting that the US robust and positive and long-standing role in the military chessboard is not welcome. Certainly has been valued and has been perceived as indispensable partner by most countries, if not all countries in the region. And as I highlighted earlier on, I think the recent announcement from the summit about the regional maritime initiative and also capacity building for law enforcement certainly is among the great news that we see from this summit. And of course, a related issue of IPEF, Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, and also the related programs on clear energy infrastructure and all that, clearly are additional indicators showing that the current administration, by the administration, has been trying to increase the capital investment and also attention, deploying attention to non-military chessboard as well. But let's not forget some other realities and also indicators that shows that despite all these good efforts and also achievements, US Indo-Pacific strategy has remained as an imbalanced one by and large, at least at the perceptual level in Southeast Asia. For example, I think many panelists earlier on, including Marie and also others, have mentioned about 150 million kind of package announced in the summit. You could see that a big chunk of it, 60 million, was actually on maritime, on defense, and also the other second largest issue was on energy. So relatively a few were invested in education, in public health, in pandemic. So that's clearly it's one indicator, and some would come so far to say that even though IPEF or US economic statecraft is not too late, but certainly is too little, especially compared to China's over the years package, especially since the launch of BRI, despite all those problems associated with BRI. And more importantly, it's actually with, there are many dimensions about IPEF that shows that there is still a reality that US is under-investing on economy. For example, IPEF is good, but it is not a substitute to TPP and CPTPP, and we do need a more active trade and investment agenda. We do need more concrete and convincing details about IPEF. I think many in Southeast Asia are kind of surprised and disappointed that many of us actually expected the IPEF to be one of the agendas for this special summit, but we realized that IPEF details will only be announced during President Biden's upcoming trip to Northeast Asia, Japan and Tokyo, particularly during the Quad. And here brings me to the second and also the last, and also the third and the last gaps that I want to highlight. That is, in Southeast Asia, we think that there is an uneven expectation in the sense that ASEAN and ASEAN-led mechanism is only seen, despite the emphasis about ASEAN centrality, so on and so forth, we are still being seen as less important in the eyes of United States policymakers, because greater attention will always be given to other non-ASEAN options, Quad, AUKUS, so on and so forth. But there are, I would say that this uneven expectation is mutual, in the sense that the US certainly is also expecting ASEAN to be stronger on it when it comes to issues like South China Sea, on Russia-Ukraine war, and also on Myanmar. But clearly, ASEAN countries are not ready to do what was expected by Washington, D.C. because of neutrality, because of centrality, and also stability. We can go in and go on and on, but I think that it is quite a widespread sentiment in Southeast Asia that ASEAN countries want to be a fulcrum, not a footnote of US Asia policy. And hence, we would continue to nervously observe what is going to happen in President Biden's upcoming trip to Northeast Asia, Korea, and also Japan. And finally, my final point is that about the uncertain prospect, and this one certainly can be wrapped up in 10 seconds, in the sense that I think it's something that many have talked about in private, especially that what will happen after the midterm elections to US-Asia policy, and more seriously, what will happen in 2024 if Trump or Trumpism comes back, and what will happen to all this US Indo-Pacific strategy, US engagement in Southeast Asia, so on and so forth. So these three gaps, I think, will continue to be in the mind of policymakers and also observers in Southeast Asia and perhaps beyond. I will stop here.
Thank you so much, Cheng Chui. A very clear kind of framework to think. I hope we'll get back to some questions. We have a few minutes left for Kavi. Kavi, welcome and thank you for joining us so late. Yes.
Well, I will be very short. Thank you very much for the invitations. I have 4 points, and I think all the points were well covered by Murray, Hiebert, and Cheng Chui. But what I want to say, number one, is this: ASEAN-US relation no longer on the autopilot mode, because the past 5 years, because of the relation, it's been autopilot. Now, Biden is in charge by appointing one of his closest security aides, Johannes Abram, to ASEAN. That is very good, to have someone who has the ear of the president. Now, the follow-up, I think Cheng Chui and also Murray Hiebert said highlight, will President Biden spend 10 days in Southeast Asia, attending 3 summits from the 10th of November to 19? ASEAN related first, and then in the middle G20, and then followed by APEC. If he could not make it, everything he said, everything he has made, it will collapse, because it shows that America does not mean it. That's my number one caveat. Number two, I think for the first time, Americans leadership really established rapport, spending times in Washington. Altogether is about 10.5 hours. Even with that quality times, our Cambodian friends said that the time is too short, have to spend some more. That is good, but I hope that there would be an opportunity. At first, ASEAN thought that we could not meet the whole cabinet, but as the Assistant Secretary pointed out, only 6 members, but that's okay. So the other points that I would like to highlight is the synergy between ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific and Americans' Indo-Pacific strategy. For a long time, since 2017, ASEAN was unhappy with American FIOP, and Americans was pragmatic enough, keep changing, make adjustment, so much so that it was well reflected in the joint vision statement this time with 2 words. The word synergy. Actually, ASEAN hate the word synergy because ASEAN think that its own outlook for Indo-Pacific is independent and has nothing to do with what America is doing in Indo-Pacific. Now, because of the attention that's been given by the Biden's and this focus and attention, ASEAN kind of blend, soften a little bit. Okay, AOIP will synergize with Americans' Indo-Pacific strategy so that they have some elements that overlap. It can complement each other. That is the key, and I think that is very good. My third point is Myanmar issue. We don't mind, actually. America can meet with NUG, but please, for Buddha's sake, don't supply weapons. We don't want to see proxy war. We don't want to see the kinds of say, no boots on the ground, but we give you weapon. And I fear that NUG could give the illusion that we are winning the war, because NUG foreign minister gave an interview recently saying that we have almost, along with ethnic group, nearly 50%, we have control over Myanmar territory. of course, I have no evidence to prove as such. We don't care if Malaysia talk to anyone. Malaysia is a maverick. It can talk to who know what. So as long as you support, America support ASEAN consensus, ASEAN, when decision is made, will go forward. It's a little bit slow because we live in the social media world, but ASEAN certainly made progress. I was so surprised that people said ASEAN did not make progress. ASEAN made progress on number 4 and number 5 soon. So by the end of the Cambodian chairmanship, 5 consensus, I think 3 of them will be achieved. The most difficult would be political dialogue and ceasefire. So I think there will be very good block that being laid by Cambodia in the future so that Indonesia can move in and build on that for the next year. So America and other dialogue countries must support ASEAN, and please do not act on your own. And NUG, I have to remind strongly, please do not let it like Ukraine. My other point is the capacity building. This is something new. And I think Murray hit the nail in the head, because if you read all the details, you know, American fact sheets on this time, my God, it looked like a thesis, very detailed with all, you know, I was so surprised to find out that there was 7,000 program, you know, that United States are doing with ASEAN. But one of the most important on security is the increased capacity of ASEAN member in maritime domain. And I think Murray Hiebert just mentioned US Coast Guard, you know, it sent the strong feelings toward the region. And of course, China probably would be very unhappy. So I expected that given this latest development in the upcoming COC meeting in person on the 24th to 27 May in Siem Reap, there will be progress. That I can guarantee. It's very good. I think there is a momentum. Finally, I like to mention that ASEAN is a top-down organization. To make sure that ASEAN-US relation prosper, reliable, sustainable, American leader must travel, must meet, must take effort, because all 10 countries, you know, our leader go and visit you. You now have to come and visit us, because this is very important. Security, that is the most important, is the security in the relation among leaders. I think Obama has done that with ASEAN leader, you know, meeting leaders 7 times, visit ASEAN 11 times. So I think Biden has this opportunity. He has laid the frame groundwork, very good, solid. Can he keep it up? Wow, 6 months. We can wait and see. Thank you, Sadhu.
Thank you very much, Kavi. All 3 speakers, what terrific remarks. I wish we could get into them, but I would be remiss because we do have a final session that looks at the social cultural elements of the US-ASEAN relationship, and kind of the perfect segue was Kavi's point about the 6,000 programs, or, you know, the detailed theses, fact sheets. It's extraordinary how much is going on day to day, not only at the national capital level, but at the subnational level between the United States and Southeast Asia. And let's give that some due, because that's a really important part of our overall relations. So thank you. And hopefully in the last session, we can come back to a few of the questions. Over to you, Piper.
Yeah, and I agree that was a perfect segue to our last panel, which is going to look at the social and cultural. And certainly on the social and cultural, there were a number of interesting results coming out of the summit. I'm going to copy Satu in terms of simply mentioning our speakers so that I can give them the most time. I'm just going to flag, I'm actually going to ask Dr. Mealy Caballero Anthony to go first among the speakers for this segment. So we have Dr. Mealy Caballero Anthony, a professor of international relations and head of the Center for Non-Traditional Security Studies at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies in Singapore. We also have Dr. Quang Minh Pham, Professor of History and Politics and Chair of the Department of International Development Studies, University of Social Sciences and Humanities, Vietnam National University in Hanoi. And we're also joined by Mr. John Brandon, the Senior Director, International Relations Program and Associate Director of the Asia Foundation. So as we look at the third ASEAN pillar of socio-cultural, what are our takeaways from the ASEAN-US Special Summit?
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. And let me also give my thanks to the East-West Center, SATU, and the ASEAN Studies Initiative at the American University. It's great to be able to talk and join you in this panel. I'll go straight to what I think are interesting discussions at the US-ASEAN Summit. And it would be, I think, a note to say that when you look at socio-cultural pillar of ASEAN, it's not just all about education and culture, but and the components under the ASEAN socio-cultural pillar actually are so broad. It goes from health to climate change, to dealing with, even drug abuses, and of course, all the other things that you put under social-cultural. So I thought that it was quite spot on that the issues that were raised initially in the October 2021 fact sheet that was announced and carried over in this summit are the three the three agreements or discussions on advancing, number one, the US-ASEAN health futures, the US-ASEAN climate futures, and people connectivity through the billions future. And these are the issues. We talk about, this big range of areas that ASEAN is working on as an organization, and that it works with dialogue partners in terms of striking or laying out possible areas of cooperation. And this is really the three that have been highlighted in the summit, have found resonance to not just the state, but to many people in ASEAN. Now, briefly on the ASEAN, US-ASEAN climate futures, I think it would be, it is interesting that there is now an initiative, although the amount that was indicated on looking at enhancing the disease surveillance in the region through the CDC center in Vietnam has received 5 million in its capacity building. That is a very important initiative because it actually supports a very important agenda in light of what's happening in now with the pandemic. And one of the things that that the pandemic has actually shown is the need to increase disease surveillance as part of the pandemic preparedness agenda. And I recall during the Obama administration, the whole emphasis on health security that looks at preparedness, response was very much there. And that, of course, got somehow lost, during the Trump administration. And now it's coming back. And this is where you find that great, meeting of the minds between the region and the US, because the US, of course, doesn't just have the capacity in terms of, but it also has the technology in working together with other partners like the WHO. And in this regard as well, the announcements about improving, for example, training of and strengthening public and healthcare workforce in the region is a very welcome development, because as we can see, and as revealed by the COVID-19 pandemic, anything that is long drawn will, of course, burden the health systems of many countries in the region, whether you are more developed or less developed. And strengthening public health capacity is known to be one of the pillars that must be strengthened if the region were to kept safe and secure. We're talking about security. So in a way, this US-ASEAN health futures sort of balances the thing that Kwek mentioned earlier about the imbalance when you look at the Indo-Pacific, because there's too much emphasis on maritime security and obviously the perception of the containment of China. So this provides a good balance. And similarly to the US-ASEAN health futures is also the US-ASEAN climate futures. And this is where I think when compared to other dialogue partners of ASEAN, at least from what I can see in the statements, the emphasis, for example, on investment in clean energy infrastructure, the talk about helping in forest future initiatives, things about reducing methane emissions, etc., etc. I mean, if you are a client, if you're interested in the extent to which actions and programs and actions on mitigating climate change, you would appreciate the contribution that a big country like the US can give to ASEAN countries. And it's not just the technology. You know, technology is there, it's abundant, but the promise, of course, of bringing in private involvement, the private sector, where there is that enables the financing of this technology to be adopted. I think it's very important because there's a lot of talk and about what you do, all this national determined contribution, but then ASEAN and other developing countries will say, yeah, fine, you have all these huge pledges that we have to make, a lot of commitment, but where is the financing? So the question is the extent to which this is going to be realized, right, is really very important. And which brings me to an important point about, with all of these announcements, US-ASEAN health futures and the US-ASEAN climate futures, unlike dialogue partners, for example, like China, right, there's no overarching mechanism that coordinates this. If you compare it to, for example, the US-ASEAN, the ASEAN-China relationship on climate change, it's both at the bilateral and the regional level. There has been since 2016 a very systematic program and mechanisms that allows for this engagement to be sustained. Now, Kavir talked about when there's a change in the politics of the US, will the US interests go down or will the US commitment also go down? And this is something, I think, to make this relationship stronger and to make this relationship more meaningful, particularly since you're hitting the right notes as far as the interests of ASEAN countries are concerned. Where is that overarching framework? I note in the 2021 discussion or in the fact sheet, there was plans of elevating environmental ministerial meetings or even the health. And I think it's a very good start. And you should start it very, very soon, because this is really something that, when you talk about, fine, we need to be able to contain China. Maritime security is a very important issue for the region, particularly when it comes to territorial competition, etc. But what are the more existential threats, security threats that many of this, that confronts not just ASEAN, but the wider region and beyond? We all talk about climate change and dealing with health issues like the pandemics. And the US has all the, all the instruments, right, and the technology and the financing that can be very, very useful and valuable to to ASEAN. And and working on this together, I think, help advances and enhances this bilateral relations. And together with that, I don't want to preempt what John is.
I'm afraid I'm going to cut you off because I am just conscious we're coming to the last moments of our session, and I do want to make sure that so I apologize for interrupting. I think it's great that the US and ASEAN are elevating their relationship. I'm going to, just for everybody, we're going to continue 5 minutes past our designated hours so that we can at least hear from Dr. Kwong and Mr. John Brandon. I'm afraid we're not going to be able to take any questions, but we will look at the questions and see if there's anything to follow up on. I'm going to go to Dr. Kwong first, and then we'll end with Mr. Brandon. Dr. Kwong.
Thank you. Thank you very much for giving me chance to talk at this very important webinar. First of all, I would like to thank you, Dr. Satu, for inviting me, and especially Dr. Amitav Acharya, a long friend. 10 years ago in Vietnam we met, and he knows that I am now in New York at Columbia University as a Fulbright. So being here in New York, I'm so happy to see the meeting. According to President Joe Biden, it's a historic summit, and it's created a new era of partnership between the US and ASEAN. So I'm so happy to witness, okay, the comprehensive agenda of the US towards ASEAN. We look very carefully in the process, in the development of this cooperation. I see that there are 5 points, okay, to show that the US has very strong commitment to ASEAN. For example, to establish, okay, the US-ASEAN Institute for Raising Leaders at Johns Hopkins, for example, university, to expand youth engagement, YCALE, for example, to promote cooperation in higher education. I am professor at the university, so I'm so happy to see such kind of statement. Number 4, to promote English language training, for example. And last but not least, to increase private sector initiative. So it's 5 very comprehensive initiative and commitment of the US. But I have a 2 points to promote or to criticize a little bit. I think number 1, it is very limited resources of the US for 10 ASEAN countries. You know, just only 70 millions every year for education and country cooperation. 70 millions US dollar to compare with more than billion, okay, billion of China, for example. China ASEAN cooperation is much stronger, just Mealy mentioned. There are also, for example, 5 million US dollar for new billion future scholarship. It's not nothing, or just only 20 academics fellow will participate in the new exchange program between ASEAN and US. So this is number 1, very limited, okay, strong commitment, but limited resources is number 1. Number 2, in education, I think that's I would like to see the mutual cooperation, not only to bring ASEAN academic and student to US, but on the other side, I would like, as professor of the university, I would like to see more academicians and students from US to come to ASEAN, right? Because in my class, I don't see any or very few students from the US or professor from the US. We would like to have, okay, any sustainability exchange must be mutual, not one way, from ASEAN to US. It's okay, but millions and millions youth people in ASEAN would like to have a more student from the US. Number 2, it would be better to support the inner within ASEAN, to bring students from Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar, and Philippines to Vietnam, and from Vietnam to other. It's within ASEAN is very important. ASEAN would like to promote connectivity, but they cannot do it. Why the EU is strong? Because they have Erasmus. The Erasmus program can bring exchange students among within EU country. ASEAN cannot. Okay, and last but not least, I think there is very few mention about the country cooperation. No country here, and I think the most important is there is big misunderstanding or a misperception in the country problem. For example, during the Vietnam War, during the Cold War, the US did not. The US underestimated, for example, the country value, the nationalism of Vietnam, for example, and other people. Or today, for example, whether Vietnam still communist, whether Vietnam and Southeast Asian countries still have a big problem of human rights, or what is American way of life for many many citizens and Southeast Asian people. For Southeast Asian country, for example, American way of life is negative, and American culture is not comparable to Canada, for example. In Vietnam, for example, the people said, "Oh, American culture is a melting pot." Why in Canada it is a mosaic? So differences between US and Canada. So I think there is still misperception, misunderstanding in the cultural problem between ASEAN and the US. So I think the last point is here to focus more on, okay, the closer gap in the misunderstanding of cultural problem. Otherwise, the cooperation will be not efficient. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And that continues the process of minding the gaps, right? So that's a useful train from the last conversation as well. John Brandon, we're going to ask you to close out this session, and in fact, to close out the whole webinar.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Piper. I appreciate it. And it's also nice to be on the panel with Mealy and Dr. Kwong. I'm going to focus a bit on education, although I know that Mealy and Dr. Kwong have covered aspects of the people-to-people ties and the social-cultural pillar. I also want to thank the East-West Center and American University's ASEAN Studies Initiative for including me. I think if the summit discussion was like today's discussion that we're having, I think that's been a positive thing, because what I gained from this is that we're looking at ASEAN on its own merits and not just part of a larger China-centric policy. I think a lot of discussions that have been in Washington have talked about the geopolitical competition between the US and China and Southeast Asia. So I've taken this last hour and a half or so, I'm very heartened by that. I think a lot of the educational programs that was announced in the joint statement and in the fact sheet is that a lot of them are similar programs with some additional funding, but there have been some initiatives. I think that two programs that have really been highlighted were the Billion Futures program, which, there are currently 100 Southeast Asians from throughout the region studying at the undergraduate and graduate level, and they're looking to include that, to expand that, and they've contributed to 5 million more. It might be viewed as a paltry or a small, modest figure, but it's nonetheless, it's an improvement. I think it should be looked upon that way. The State Department is planning on doubling its YSEALI program. I mean, they currently 450 people participate from YSEALI and come to the United States. They're going to expand that within the next 3 years to 900. So I think that's positive. In fact, I'm meeting with a group next week from Northern Illinois University who've done a YSEALI program. They're in Illinois for 3 weeks, and they come to Washington next week. And I look forward to meeting them for the first time in a few years because of the pandemic. The State Department, to take Dr. Kwong's point, the US-ASEAN Visiting Scholars Program, they're looking to double that. And I agree with you, Dr. Kwong, we should have more Americans going to Southeast Asia like we're having Southeast Asians come to the United States. They're also, the State Department is also expanding the English language programs in Southeast Asia, and say, well, why is that important? Well, if you look at it, ASEAN is the official language used amongst the grouping. So building capacity for hundreds of thousands of English teachers throughout Southeast Asia to teach the language where people from ASEAN can best communicate, I think is important. The YSEALI now has 155,000 alumni. What will that be? That's in a little over a 10-year period. How many will there be? I would think that we're talking maybe about 500,000 in about a 10-year period. So I think that's important. The foundation has had the opportunity to implement some programs on the future of work in ASEAN through the U.S. Embassy of Singapore, and also on ocean jobs for a sustainable future through the U.S. Embassy in Timor-Leste. And this was done virtually because of COVID-19. But I think I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about private sector initiatives that can complement these efforts. US companies have announced new initiatives to create opportunities for education, training, and enhancing skills throughout Southeast Asia. Google has given a $4 million grant to the Asia Foundation in supporting a program we call Go Digital ASEAN, which will support 200,000 small and medium-sized enterprises in Southeast Asia with the skills to help them grow their businesses. And Google's collaborating with the State Department to build digital literacy among youth in Southeast Asia and at American spaces throughout the region. Talking about Myanmar, because you could feel that that country is going to be left out particularly in this pillar. But the US, to their great credit, the US-ASEAN Business Council Institute has launched the Myanmar Scholarship Fund to support students who are here in the United States who have been sort of caught because of the political turbulence in their nation, and to provide financial assistance to those. There's approximately about 5,000 students from Myanmar here in the United States, and I think that will be very helpful. Just prior to the summit, the US announced an initiative, but it's going to be supported by the private sector. It's called the US-ASEAN Institute for Rising Leaders. It's going to be 30 ASEAN officials that come and study at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies for a 10-year period. It's a small number, but it's something that you can look to build on. And the fact that the private sector is willing to support this endeavor is, I believe, important. So as we move forward, it's important for the US government and the private sector to work together to create public-private partnerships to foster and strengthen US Southeast Asia relations through ASEAN. And I think I would also want to say that maybe these are all different types of programs, but I think it would be important to bring together officials from the US government, the private sector, non-government organizations, think tanks, and universities to try to create an overarching strategy on how to bolster this socio-cultural pillar. I think that would help to allow the United States to have a bigger bang for its buck, whether it's US government funds or private funds. So with that, let me end there, and thank you very much, Piper.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Satu, thank you, East-West Center. And Satu, I'm going to hand over to you to close. I think we may actually.
Hello, all. It brings me no pleasure to close, really, because I'm hearing such extraordinarily informative, insightful, rich discussions here. But unfortunately, we're already 12 minutes over our time. And all that tells me is that as we move to the summits in July and we move to the summits in November, there will be ample opportunities to take stock. And as you'll recall, Assistant Secretary Kritenbrink, in fact, mentioned that he would very much like to do that. So we will be in touch with all of you again. I welcome your visits to the East-West Center in Honolulu, in Washington. And of course, I look forward to seeing many of you in the region over the coming months. So please stay safe. Thank you for your participation. Thanks for our cooperative partners at American University and the ASEAN Studies Initiative. Good day, good night, and be well.